I'll let you guys get set up, and I'm going to start things off. Hey everybody, welcome. So my name is Claire Vanderick. I'm a volunteer with Preserve Minneapolis. So excited to see all you guys here. So thank you so much for being here today. I just wanted to welcome you to our 2017 season of the what was formerly called Breakfast with the Preservationists and Happy Hour with the Preservationists. Some of you probably recognize me, a lot of you probably recognize Bob. So Bob's been leading the Breakfast with the Preservationists for a long time. I've been doing the happy hours, we alternate months. And Bob and I had some conversation and drinks. Bob and I had some conversations over the course of several months about how we felt like the name Breakfast with the Preservationists and the name Happy Hour with the Preservationists didn't really describe what we were doing and what the events were. And so we wanted to come up with a name and a brand for what these things are so that people can better understand what they're signing up for and what they're going to be attending when they come. So with that, our new name for these events in the morning is the Morning Forums. And the reason for that is the intention with these morning events is that they're more of a discussion, more of a presentation, more of a speaker-style series of events. And hopefully we're intending to bring to you not only topics that relate specifically and directly to preservation, but things that maybe you wouldn't otherwise tie in with preservation, but that you'll see over time that do. And with that, we've got a couple of different ideas in the hopper as far as like regional development that's going on in Minneapolis. That includes preservation, young leaders in preservation, these kinds of things. So look forward to some great events coming up this year. The counterpart to that is the Happy Hour with Preservationists. So those are now called Evening Explorations. And the idea with that is that those events are more tied towards tours, experiences that hopefully the intention is that you wouldn't otherwise get to have. I mean, we tend to connect with private business owners, private building owners that own buildings that somehow relate to adaptive reuse, historic preservation, that kind of thing, and give you guys an opportunity to go check those places out and hear from those owners and have conversations about what preservation is in the real world and what people that are out there working in preservation are doing today. So that will start off, we'll kick that off next month. So look forward, if you follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, look forward for an announcement as well in our newsletter. So today we're going to start off with the first topic, which is probably one of the more notable preservation stories in Minneapolis, which is the Metropolitan building. I always suggest if you have Facebook to follow us on Facebook. You're probably going to get the most up-to-date and recent updates through Facebook. We usually announce things there. But then we also have I think it's a weekly newsletter that goes out, or just like anytime we have events that goes out, and you can sign up with that through our website.
And on Facebook, you'd look for what?
Preserve Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yep, if you just search for Preserve Minneapolis, you'll find us. So, Bob, why don't you give a quick introduction while David finishes getting your slides up, and we'll take things off.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I'll just add one more thing about changing the name from Breakfast with the Preservationists to Morning Forums. Kathleen and I were at an event yesterday, and it's called Urban Currents, but they serve breakfast.
Oh.
And then we have breakfast with the preservation traditionally, and we have donuts and coffee. But I think for our last event was in December. It's the invitational we have every year, where we ask people to submit their idea for a particular theme that we have. And the theme last year was buildings that you have an affinity for. And that went really well. How many people submitted something that were here? Right, okay. And it was, what we found out is that people like myself that like architecture were looking for how people had an affinity for some architectural building that meant something that way. But as it turns out, there were past associations to what that building once represented that intrigued a lot of people. And so that went pretty well. So I think, David, are we about ready to go?
Yeah, 1 second.
Yeah, we had a delay there getting the code for access to the projector, but now that we have that. Okay. I'm going to just use an article that Rick Nelson, food critic for the Star Tribune, wrote in 2011. And it really says everything about the what we want to know here. He said, it's been 50 years since the workers took their first swing at the fabled Metropolitan building, but the wounds to the city's psyche and skyline still seem fresh. If only we could travel back in time 121 years or to 1890, when 8,000 people, including the upper reaches of Minneapolis society, gathered to celebrate the opening of what was originally called the Northwestern Guarantee Loan Building. It was billed correctly as the largest, most lavish office building in the Northwest, and was a study in contrast with its ponderous stone exterior masking a breathtaking interior atrium, which is what we see here. Sunlight pouring in from the enormous skylight shimmered through green glass block floors and bathed the soaring space in an aquatic, cathedral-like glow. The most profound experience we had was walking into the Metropolitan building and witnessing one of the most exciting spaces that we'd ever seen, is how the editors of Progressive Architecture magazine, aghast at the prospect of the building's impending destruction, described the Met's light court in 1960. The Met's demolition, we can probably go on to the next slide. Okay, we'll go on to the, this one isn't too clear. Go on to the next one. And that shows the Met there. Stylistically, the Metropolitan was a trendsetter. The light court's filigreed grillwork presaged Art Nouveau movement by a decade. 6 manually operated birdcage-style elevators and their machinery were open for all to see. A delicate form follows function solution. And the sweetness and light, that thrilling 11-story atrium, which architect E. Townsend Mix gift-wrapped for maximum contrast. Its hulking, rough-hewn facade was ahead of architecture's brutalist movement by several generations. The first three floors boasted a 4-foot-thick exterior walls of green New Hampshire granite, Red Lake Superior sandstone quarried near Houghton, Michigan, trimmed the upper 9 floors where the exterior walls slimmed to 2 feet thick. Hallways were lined with 7-foot-high Italian marble wainscoting, and the doors and windows were trimmed in a veritable forest of irreplaceable old-growth oak. Go to the next slide. The open-air rooftop garden and observation tower were tourism magnets for more than a quarter century. Gibbs Restaurant initially occupied much of the 12th floor, where 50 cents bought a multi-course dinner served on Haviland china by tuxedo-clad waiters. Its owner was Jasper Gibbs, an African-American, and the Minneapolis Tribune described the rooms of the sumptuous restaurant as a marvel of comfort, elegance, and convenience, the largest, finest restaurant west of Chicago. The city of Minneapolis in 1890 was 23 years old, with a population of 165,000, and had its first world-class work of architecture. For several decades thereafter, the building was the pride of the city, and 301 2nd Avenue South was the most prestigious business address. Along with owner Louis Menage's variable interests, original tenants included forerunners of the Sioux Line Railroad, Wells Fargo, and Pillsbury. It quickly became the state's #1 rental property for high-powered attorneys who made use of the 11th floor's 10,000-volume law library. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company took over the title in 1905 and put the name on the building. Over the next few decades, as the city's business core began to migrate away from the river, the Met's Class A status waned. By 1930s, the Met was a barn half empty, recalled a former janitor in a 1941 newspaper story. The building was nearly converted to a parking garage during the Depression, but wartime demand for office spaces reversed the declining fortunes. Locals H.D. Michelle and Melvin Hansen bought it from the Metropolitan Life in 1946 for $450,000. At the time, it was almost completely occupied, primarily by government agencies. The former top-floor restaurant was a sea of gray U.S. Army desks. So we can see how the decline started here. Post-war downtown Minneapolis was ailing, and a dramatic gesture was thought to be the only cure. The plan demolished the city's Skid Row, 22 blocks, a third of the business district, and started over with a clean slate. It was called Gateway, and the Met, perched on the district's southeastern edge, initially made the preservation cut, but opinions reversed. Still, the Met's owners found their landmark on the chopping block. The city's powerful Housing and Redevelopment Authority, HRA, laid out a case for the building's destruction. In September 1961, Minneapolis Star op-ed piece written by General Counsel Ben Palmer. The bottom line was, it was old, it was ugly, it was in the way and had to go. End of argument. Although they put up a good fight, the building owners and many admirers didn't stand a chance. What happened was that this was before the historic preservation movement really started, and same in St. Paul. So when the end came, there was no one other than a few individuals to fight for it. What's odd is how HRA's public sector leadership seemed obsessed with the economic viability of a privately owned venture. Given the opportunity, HRA argued, the Met's tenants would flee from the dowdiness, even though the building was 98% occupied in 1958 and generated $300,000 a year in revenues for its owners. Still, the long process of condemnation started in May 1959. The HRA and its director, Robert Jorvig, enlisted the formidable influence of the city's fire marshal, who initially declared the building a fire trap. Shortly before demolition, he reversed his opinion, endorsed the building's preservation, and considerably cut the cost estimate of fire safety retrofit, but by then it was too late. No complaint was too small for Palmer and HRA's lawyers to forge into ammunition. The Met wouldn't fit in with it. Gateway's trendy plazas, he argued. Since the building had no setback from the street, it lacked air conditioning, which Palmer experienced firsthand, and since the agency's offices were located on the Met's 12th floor. Ironically, architect Robert Cerny, a Gateway mastermind who received several plum commissions in the district, also officed in the Met while plotting its destruction. The HRA is not destroying the building. The Metropolitan building has lived its economic life and cannot survive without a transfusion, Cerny explained. While describing the building exterior as a monstrosity in the eyes of most observers, Palmer noted that the Sheridan, IBM, and top-tier tenants would steer clear of the Gateway if their modern structures sat adjacent to something old-fashioned. The CEOs of both businesses issued contrary statements shortly thereafter. That was, I remember, a big argument at the time, that it wouldn't attract these Sheraton and other IBM buildings. Does anybody know where those buildings are now? 30 years from now, the buildings in the renewal area will be 30 years old, while this one would have been 100 years old and showing, that Palmer wrote, in a bitter irony given a lifespan of many of Gateway's throwaway structures. IBM was raised in 1985 after just 22 years, and the 27-year-old Sheraton went down in 1990. Okay, hit next slide. So that was the front, one of the front entrances. Next slide. Interior. Sorry, these slides, these are what Minneapolis Public Library photo collection gave me, but a last-ditch effort involving the city's buying the building as a city hall annex didn't gain a lot of traction from an indifferent city council. The Met, 1961, it anchored the corner of 3rd Street and 2nd Avenue South in downtown Minneapolis for 71 years. The building's last remaining tenants were evacuated on Halloween 1961. 7 weeks later, on an overcast Tuesday morning, sledgehammers hit the sandstone trim on the building's roof, although the literally rock-solid Met didn't go without putting up a fight. The last bits of debris were hauled away September 23rd, 1962, 5 months behind schedule. Quote, a victim of the peculiar American idea that motion is the same thing as progress, read the Minneapolis Star-Tribune columnist Don Morrison's eulogy. The HRA's post-demolition did not go any further. Next slide, please. And there's the light court again. This was before air conditioning, and the light court really helped temper the air a bit. And also, when it was built, electric lights were just starting, and they weren't as efficient as they are now. So that was another advantage for the light court. It promptly became, after demolition, a parking lot, which is the fate of so many historic buildings. It's one of the most expensive parking lots in the history of Minneapolis, Hansen later noted in his observation. Parts of the building were salvaged, and we're going to hear more about that soon. The intricate grillwork disappeared in homes and businesses. Next slide. And next. There's a start to the demolition. Next. And next. And next. Many of the massive stone blocks were laid to rest in the Delano landfill. Some of that granite recently has been resurrected and repurposed into a sculpture park project in South Minneapolis. Next. A relentless, banal office building filled the parking lot in 1980. A dose of suburban blahs popped down onto the streets of downtown Minneapolis. It may be standing on the site of the mighty Metropolitan, but it never replaced it. Nothing could. I think that's our last slide. And Dick Cronick has some slides that if he could pop in as well. Meantime, any comments? Is everybody too stunned or what?
The demise of the building, the demolition of the building reminded me of thinking of looking at live execution.
Yeah.
And no matter what, you may look at it because you want to have the gawkers thrill, but the fact of the matter remains is that it was something that shouldn't have been demolished, and it's something that I think our city planners and fathers had very short-sighted vision on. So it's unfortunate, but hopefully we'll learn from our mistakes out here.
Just wondering if in a very macabre kind of way, the loss of this building got us to think, about preserving, other structures, and that it almost took the loss of a magnificent structure like this to get that conversation ramped up, and sort of sacrifice this building for thinking about others and what we want to do going forward. Is that a possibility?
Yes and no. This is where historic preservation movement really started after this with public consciousness. And although it started with this, what helped spur that further, Larry Millett wrote a book called Lost Twin Cities. That, Larry Millett his book really brought the consciousness. It really drove the point home that you're making. Not that stopped demolition. Some years later, when the Preservation Alliance first started, we were having breakfast at Nickel Island Inn, and Mayor Don Fraser was there. Everybody loved Don Fraser, but we in preservation knew he was no friend of historic preservation. And while Don was talking, he looked over his shoulder, and they're tearing down more buildings on the south end of Nicollet Island. And the look in his eye, and he made a comment, maybe that shouldn't happen over there. So in 1972, in downtown St. Paul, the city government and HUD and other people wanted to tear down what was called the U.S. Postal Office and can't remember the exact name of it, but now it's called Landmark Center. Yes. And that came 6 days away from demolition when a group of people who had started the preservation movement enough then, they were just a little bit ahead of Minneapolis, and they were able to put a stop to it. And sometime while it was still being debated as to how to save it, some planners from the East Coast, of course, came to advise downtown St. Paul on something, and its planners were just marveled at Landmark Center. It's for those of you who haven't seen it, it has some similarities to the Metropolitan building. It's Renaissance Revival, Romanesque Revival stone exterior, and it has 6 floors and has a skylight above it, and it has a series of columns that support the edges of the floors. It's called a cortile. It's a very beautiful building. So that preservation movement in St. Paul started just in time for that. That was 1972, and there's 2 other things that happened in 1972. My wife and I were living in a neighborhood in Seward West area, as it was called then, and there's a little street with houses close up to it called Milwaukee Avenue. So none of us knew anything about historic preservation, so we became accidental preservationists. The same thing at the same time was happening in St. Paul with Irvine Park. Beautiful collection of excellent examples of various, it's a sample book, like the Whitman the Sampler of architectural styles of late 19th century. Okay, I've talked long enough. Someone else. Any other questions? Anders.
Hold on, Anders. Don't push the button.
As to your comment about whether it changed things, I think that it is still part of the cultural understanding in Minneapolis that demolition is progress, and that is a very difficult piece to deal with when you deal with preservation issues, because the people who are trying to preserve something are generally portrayed as people who are backward thinking. And it is, I just think it is a part of our cultural understanding and legacy, and that's the piece that's very, very hard to change. And I think one of the things you're commenting about is when people from outside come in and validate what we have historically.
Yes, excellent point.
It's very useful because people don't respect what we have culturally, and that's a very difficult piece for preservation.
There's always this conflict.
Anders and I have direct experience.
All you have to do is look at Wayzata. I mean, there's nothing left.
But it's different in St. Paul. It's very different in St. Paul.
Somewhat different. Larry Millette will say just somewhat different. But Anders, you and I experienced that 3 years ago with the Healy building in the Wedge area. It went down. Didn't have to. Okay, next.
I was curious, is there some, who designed the Metropolitan building?
E. Townsend Mix, his name is.
And that was New York architect, Chicago, local, Milwaukee?
You started in Milwaukee, and then eventually moved to Minneapolis in 1889, I believe, to superintend the building of the Metropolitan building. And I'm not sure if he stayed here. That's the only bit I remember about his history.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll see Dick's slides now. David, if we could take a look at.
So yeah, if you could go to the next slide, please. Some of you know Jack Byers. Jack has for a long time been at CPED, the city planning office in Minneapolis. I want to read you. Does anybody know who the woman on the right side is? I don't recall her name. Anyway, that was in 2010, and I want to start here by reading part of an email that was sent to a few preservation-minded people on May 11th, 2010. And it says, "Hello, my name is Chad Kestner. I am the Vice President of Operations for Combined Aggregate Enterprises, LLC in Delano, Minnesota. Recently, our company purchased a piece of property that at one time was a stockyard for a large monument manufacturing facility. We initially purchased this property for the purpose of crushing the leftover granite into Class 5 and Class 2 road material for our existing and future projects. In our setup phase, we discovered a large, well-organized stack of granite containing a great deal of pre-cut blocks along with many intricately carved pieces. After researching the stone further, we found that this stack was what we believed to be the majority of the granite from the Minneapolis Metropolitan building torn down in the early 60s. So in response to that email, a group of people got together in 2010, and I was part of that, to go out and see what was out in the Delano Stone Yard and see if there was any way to salvage it in any way. And so we went out there, and this is some of us on the pile. And next slide, please. So this gives you some idea of the size of this pile. It was about the length of a football field, about 300 yards long, all sitting right next to, I think it's the Crow Wing River that runs through Delano. And it flooded every spring, and there was vines growing all over everything. So these are the guys. This is Chad, I believe, on the right, who sent that first email. So we went out there and just first tried to get an idea of what there was, and was any of it salvageable. And then next slide, please. So Ginny Lakovic was, and I think still is, at HGA Architects. Does anybody know? Is that correct? She's a vice president, I think, at HGA at this point. And she was part of our group. She spent about 50 or 60 hours out in that pile figuring out what was what. And this is her diagram. She added the coloring, and the light yellow pieces were pieces that she positively identified, and then the yellow pieces were things that she thought probably she knew where they went on the building. And so we came up with the plan. Actually, it was my suggestion that we create a freestanding, essentially a triumphal arch that was the original entryway to the Metropolitan building. Actually, there were two identical entrances, one on 2nd Avenue and one on 3rd Street, or 3rd Avenue and, other way around. No, 2nd Avenue and 3rd Street. And so we thought maybe between, all the pieces that were there from the two entrances, we could make one. And that turned out to be not quite true. There were still some pieces that had just been smashed, and we couldn't salvage them in any way. And so those are the gray areas that you see here. And so then, of course, the problem became money. And Dean Phillips of the scion of the Phillips Distilling Company was part of our group. He started the ante with $30,000, but it turned out that the estimate to just move the stone from Delano to someplace in the city would cost over $1 million. And we didn't get much extra money besides what Dean started the pot with. And so the thing just fell into disarray. And I want to read you one other thing. This is from a friend of mine in California named Mark Hammonds. Some of you may be aware of him. And Mark wrote me a note. Mark was around the town here when the Metropolitan was taken down. And he wrote, "The Metropolitan was destroyed solely," and I'm not sure that's probably true, but he says solely because it didn't have a mortgage. In other words, it was a paid off building. And it had full occupancy of tenants, which was competition to the flashy new buildings that did have big debt service, most notably the then new U.S. Bank building, for which the New York Life building, another sad removal from Minneapolis, had been removed for exactly the same reason. So, all of this has a lot to do with money. And no surprise, of course, to anybody. Anyway, that's all I had. I just wanted to show you, where all this stuff was. And I lost track of what has happened to the stone out there. I suspect that the guys did what they said they were going to do. They crushed it and sold it for roadbed. And so very sad. But there are little bits and pieces of the Metropolitan building around town. And I've heard that I've never been into this place, but somewhere around downtown, there's an Irish pub that has a stained glass window from the Metropolitan behind the bar. I've heard that the rock and jazz club on Nicollet Avenue called the Ice House has pieces of the Metropolitan building used as decorative elements that were acquired at this time in 2010. And somebody has made a fence out of iron that was done for the building. So there are bits and pieces of Metropolitan. Yeah.
There's some intricately carved stone pieces at Target Field Station, which had its grand opening several years ago. That's the neighborhood I come from, and I was part of that planning process. But there's a Caribou Coffee inside in the area of Target Field Station, and next to that there's a stone sculpture. The centerpiece is not from the Metropolitan, but all the horseshoe of seating around it is all stones from the Metropolitan, and they're the intricate ones.
Thank you. Another comment that I'll make is when the Metropolitan building was demolished, I was in architecture school at the U of M, and in an art history class, Frederick Kerper, the instructor, spent a brief paragraph talking about the Metropolitan building, and his concluding words were, "Let the ball swing." So that's kind of where he wasn't just speaking for himself. The architecture profession during that time held pretty similar attitudes, because obviously any new building would be better than an old building in their minds. This kind of proves the contrary. So
That's one of the things, so we were talking about the places that the Metropolitan building, you'll find it around Minneapolis. So, but you had mentioned the Ice House. First and First is the development company that developed the Ice House on Nicollet. Also the Broadway in Northeast. And so Peter Remesh, who owns First and First, acquired some of those blocks and he's used it. I think he still has some blocks that he hasn't even used yet. So you'll probably continue to see parts of it. But if you go to the Broadway, one of the things that he does with his projects is tries to incorporate public space in his projects. So like with the Broadway or with Ice House, those plazas that are off the buildings are public. You know, if you don't, you can go to those even if you're not getting a drink at the Ice House or going to 612, you can go and sit there and read. And so that's kind of the similar to the Target field thing, that it's a really great opportunity to interact with the building without having to actually like be a patron of anything. So go check that out too. There's a waterfall that has stones from the Metropolitan over by the Broadway.
As a serious jazz fan, when Charlie Parker died, immediately the slogan came out, "Bird lives." And Claire, would you mind, speaking of rock and roll and jazz, if Dick could give a plug for his next performance?
Oh man, I'm scared you're going to ask me to say.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm a musician. I play string bass and electric bass and sing and write songs, and I'm a jazz player. My quintet, called the Chronic Quintet, plays twice a month at a club in downtown St. Paul called the Public Kitchen and Bar. Our next gig is actually next Tuesday, though, in Osseo. I'm sure you all want to run right out to Osseo and hear us at a place called NOLA. Anyway, if you're interested in my music, just Google Richard Chronic and you'll find me. One more thing about the Metropolitan building. I tracked down the source of the granite that was on the first 3 floors. It came from New Hampshire, specifically a place called North Conway, New Hampshire. And so it's all New Hampshire and Maine granite. And the company actually had stone yards in New Hampshire and in Maine. And North Conway is just across the border from Maine on the northeast edge of New Hampshire. And they had a 300-foot long building where all this stuff was carved. 500 people eventually were employed carving the granite for the first 3 floors of the Metropolitan building. That's all I have.
All right, well, we've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to flip the lights back on here. Does anybody have any other comments, questions for Dick or Bob?
We just did a project at Claire's house, and as part of that project, there was a history done of her house. She lives in a very small, modest 1880s house on Grand Avenue, and it was built by Louis Menage, who built this building, owned that. He ended up going to South America, I think, when his company collapsed, I believe. Small world.
Yeah, Louis Menage did a lot of real estate development in Minneapolis. And I think there's a Menage addition to the city of Minneapolis, too.
Peter, you know something about Louis Menage. Why don't you get the microphone at some point, but that gentleman has already.
My grandfather had a office in the Guarantee Loan Building for 10 years, and then in 1917, he and the guy who built my house were board members of the Metropolitan Bank building, Metropolitan Bank, and they decided to build a building called the Metropolitan Bank Building at 608 2nd Avenue South, and invested in that building and were board members of that bank, and moved out of this Metropolitan building, which they had occupied for 10 years, along with some of their cousins, the Pillsburys, and had a big deal of this new modern building called the Metropolitan Bank Building. And this was an update and modernization of a then 27-year-old building, this building. And now the preservation group, which is this, I understand, has blessed the the conversion of the Metropolitan Bank building into living space. It's a 13-story building that is that worked as a bank-owned building for 100 years, and so that's kind of ironic.
So there are several excellent articles written about the originator of the guarantee loan company, Louis Menage, and you can find those either online or through special collections. But basically, the entire empire was a giant fraud. And this building was one of those things that screened that from the public imagination. They saw this tremendously successful company. So this was a monument to a company that really had no financial underpinning whatsoever. It's sort of ironic to think of a very solid building and a company that basically collapsed in the national panic of 1893. Yes. Yeah, well, there are many ironies within ironies. I've been interested in Menage because he, along with other properties, owned much of the city lake district, especially around Lake Calhoun and Lake Harriet. And when I was preparing a tour of Lakewood Cemetery back in 2009, I went around and I had information from the website as far as find a grave sort of thing in Lakewood. And I went searching for those people who had been involved in the Lake District, and I come across the very prominent site that Menage had bought and found an unmarked grave site. So I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to take one or more of these salvaged pieces of stone and create a monument to his empire and his failure? But they're beautiful, beautifully carved pieces of stone. So I still have that dream someday, if we can find somebody who has the funds and or the access to a piece of stone to mark his gravesite at Lakewood.
And that's a good segue to the next thing I wanted to mention, which is about tours. Peter not only leads tours of various aspects of Minneapolis, but Peter is the chair of the Preserve Minneapolis Tours Committee. And as probably most of you know, every summer we at Preserve Minneapolis put on a series of walking tours all over the city. And we need volunteers. We need volunteers to lead tours and also volunteers to help lead tours. And so if you have any interest in that, talk to Peter. He's the main guy to get you hooked up with the tours coming up this summer.
I have one other comment here, and that Larry Millett wrote another book, his most recent book. It's called Heart of St. Paul, and it describes the Pioneer building and the Endicott connecting building. And the Pioneer building, remarkably, has a light court of 12 stories. And it also had wrought iron spiral staircases and other work facing the light court. But the city of St. Paul Building Inspections Department just decided they didn't want to be any more frightened than they already were, and ordered those to be enclosed in glass. But it's still, you can get an idea of what the Metropolitan building looked like, and it is a handsome building.
One of the Waco James Leaks a year or so ago, I don't know if it's called Cityscapes or something like that. But does anyone know if there's still walking tours of Minneapolis? He would point out where old buildings had been and the values of them, and some of the new buildings and things that have been replaced. Of course, the Metropolitan. but another resource, at least it looked like, in terms of walking tours having to do with this kind of architecture. Anyone know if they're still doing walking tours like that?
Is that James Lilacs?
James Leaks through the Star Trip.
Okay. I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything about that. But we had the tours, and Peter can probably better speak to this than I can, but the tours are the catalog of tours we try to change up, and we definitely have had tours in past seasons that are of buildings that are no longer. One of them that I went on a couple summers ago, and I'm going to hand this over to Peter after this, so be prepared, Peter, is that was of landmarks that related to LGBT history. And so a lot of those landmarks don't exist anymore, so we were just walking around downtown pointing at that used to be there. But it was really interesting. So you bring up a really great point, and that maybe would be a good contact for us for a potential guide in the future. But Peter, would you talk a little bit about what tours we're going to have this season?
Well, we'll know more about it after our meeting this evening. Thank you. So Preserve Minneapolis took over the summer walking tour program from the Minneapolis HBC about 6 years ago, and we offer typically about 27 tours during the summer, May to September, and we repeat some favorite tours like the Red Cedar Lane tour that Dick Cronick leads, but we also make a point of trying to introduce additional tours, both for the interest of people who are the regular attendees of the program, and also we've been making an effort in recent years to add to the diversity of the tours we have, whether it was the LGBT tour that Claire mentioned or the East 38th Street African American community in South Minneapolis we started last year. So we're very much seeking out some further diversity reflecting the heritage of our community in general, not only historic buildings, but also the nature of communities. And one tour this year will be led by Kate Bean, who is a descendant of Chief Cloudman, who led the village at Lake Calhoun or Bedemakaska. So look for that. If you follow any of the sources mentioned earlier, the Facebook page, our website, etc., the list of tours will be coming out sometime in April.
All right, great. Well, yeah, and if we want a donut, Bob's passing them out. Did you want to comment?
I just had a question. I'm wondering if anybody's heard anything about Brenda Euland's house. I don't know if you know who Brenda is. She's a very important feminist and author, and apparently it's threatened.
So the HPC at its hearing last week supported and approved the staff report recommending the denial of the demolition permit request. I suspect that's not the final word on the property, and anybody who is interested in her legacy and that house potentially honoring that can look at the staff report on the HPC website, because I think the owner has an investment that they're not prepared to let go of. 2620 West 46th Street. It's immediately west of Lake Harriet. It's on 44th Street, 2620 44th, yeah. Yeah. So I don't know that, I don't think the HPC videotapes or broadcasts on cable their hearings, but there was a very nice statement that Brenda's step-grandson, Eric Utney, wrote. He's currently writing a book about mentorship and citing his experience with Brenda in her later years. So he's very articulate, as you can imagine. So stay tuned, and if you're interested, look it up and send something into the HPC.
I'll have the last word. I definitely want to go to that hearing because Eric's lady friend, Jerry Riley, who she and I worked together on the Milwaukee Avenue project, Jerry told me I have to go to that. So I always do what women tell me to do. So well, it's 9 o'clock, And thank you so much for coming. This is a great audience. And we'll see you in April.